Tuesday, December 19, 1905. The Scranton Truth, Scranton, Pennsylvania. Men buried in the Pennsylvania Tunnel to Long Island City. New York, December 19. 100 men are working like Trojans this morning in the attempt to rescue a number of men who are entombed in the Pennsylvania Railroad Tunnel in Long Island City. The exact number of men who are clinging to life in the tunnel is not known. The railroad company officials say there are 2, while the police state there are 6 or 8. To the horror of the situation is added the possibility that the entombed men may be drowned by a rush of water from Newtown Creek when the tide reaches its highest point. That the men are still alive this morning was shown by their tapping on the iron pipes which pass through the portion of the tunnel in which they are buried. These signals were distinctly heard by those who are conducting the work of rescue, and caused them to do all in their power to remove the tons of rock and earth as quickly as possible to release their imprisoned companions. It is thought that the men will be reached this afternoon. One of the men known to be buried is Frank Cale. The railroad officials admit there is another man with him, but his name they do not know. The entombment of the men is due to a cave-in of a section of the tunnel under the Long Island Railroad yards. It is believed the men are at least 50 feet from the surface. The break was discovered at East and Borden Avenues over a drift of the tunnel, which extends to the eastward of the shaft where the operations were begun. At this point, S. Pearson & Sons contractors have erected a heavy superstructure upon which is hoisted all of the broken stone and other material taken from the tunnel, and from which it is loaded into cars to be hauled away. A high fence surrounds the premises, and all that can be seen of the cave-in is that part of it extending into the street. This is an opening about 30 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 20 feet deep. In this water, pipes, gas mains, and a brick sewer were broken, and it is the water from the sewer which has caused much of the trouble. The break extends under the superstructure and is shown by the settling of the heavy timbers, and extends to the shaft, which is the only means of escape from the tunnel. The cave-in occurred early yesterday morning, but the tunnel officials declared that it amounted to nothing and that all would be remedied before night. Those in authority about the tunnel entrance denied that any men were trapped in the tunnel, but the hasty setting up of air compressors and other appliances to get air into the tunnel made it plain that workmen had been entombed. Not until a flagman in the railroad yards heard a faint rapping on an iron pipe, which leads down into the tunnel, was it admitted that at least 2 men were caught in the trap below. The flagman was passing the pipe, which protrudes several feet above the surface of the ground, when his attention was attracted by a rapping. He listened and the sound was repeated. He then took up an iron spoke and rapped a reply. Then came a vigorous rapping from below, signifying that the signal was understood. The flagman notified the superintendent of the construction company, who directed men to begin digging immediately over where the sounds were first heard. After digging 6 feet underground, the pipe was disjointed, and one of the laborers called down through the pipe. He declared that he heard the voices of the imprisoned men calling back a reply, but he could not understand what was said. A cluster of incandescent electric lamps was then lowered into the pipe as a signal of encouragement. Another series of raps on the pipe signified that the flashes from the lamps were seen. A vigorous effort is being made to plug up the sewer at the mouth of Newtown Creek. It is through this sewer that the flooding of the tunnel is probable. At high tide, the water from the creek backs up far inland, and as the break in the sewer has been continually widening since the last flood tide, it is feared that a volume of water sufficient to flood the tunnel will be admitted unless the effort to plug it at its mouth succeeds. The engineers say the water could be kept back by forcing air into the tunnel, but that the pressure of the air would be fatal to the entombed men. Men reached. The two entombed men who have been imprisoned since 3 o'clock this morning in the Pennsylvania Railroad Tunnel in Long Island City were reached today by a diver. He found the men alive but exhausted. Returning to the top of the tunnel shaft, the diver obtained stimulants and food, which he carried back to the men. Had the prisoners been able to swim, they could have been brought at once, but they were too weak to make the attempt. The water was then 5 feet deep. It was expected that in a few hours the pumps, which have been working continuously since the accident happened, would have lowered the flood sufficiently for the men to be carried out. The divers, there were 5 of them, did not dare attempt a rescue until this was done. Meantime, the work of sinking a shaft from the surface to the chamber where the men were imprisoned was abandoned. Work had progressed to the depth of about 30 feet, or about 3/5 of the total distance. The men, Antonio Fraga and Franco Francisco, were lying prostrate on the floor of the airlock when found by the diver, gave both men whiskey, and then, promising a quick rescue, went back after food. Had it not been for a concrete partition blocking the tunnel 50 feet away from where the men were stationed, a rescue could have been made in a boat. The passageway through the partition was a doorway about 5 feet in height, and owing to the high level of the water, it was impossible to get the boat through. A great crowd of several thousand persons gathered about the tunnel shaft this morning, most of them laborers, anxiously awaiting news from below. It was necessary to call out the police reserves to preserve order. The 2 men imprisoned since Sunday in the flooded shaft B of the Pennsylvania Tunnel in Long Island City were brought out by divers at 2 o'clock this afternoon and taken to the hospital.